Hey folks, welcome back to Mr. Times Classics channel. In this episode I'm back in Olympia, but this time I'm just checking out the Temple of Zeus, having a look at its architecture, its decoration, and of course the statue within it. Let's get straight into it. So we're back in the region of Elis, inside the Sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia. This site is the birthplace of the ancient Olympic Games, and right at the heart of the whole sanctuary is this, the temple to the King of the Gods, the Temple to Zeus. Now, the temple itself is located in a part of the sanctuary known as the Altis. This is a sort of irregular quadrangle in which not just the Temple of Zeus is located, but also his giant ash altar where the sacrifices take place, the hero shrine to the hero Pelops, and the temple to Hera, Zeus's wife. Now, we'll look at the architecture of the temple first of all. And the temple was constructed by the architect Libon of Elis. So that's a local architect from the region in which Olympia is located. He constructed the temple between 472 and 456 BC, which means it took 16 years of construction. And that tells you just how big and grand a temple it was meant to be. It measured in something around 27 meters by 64 meters, so it's quite imposing and it dominates the entire area of the sanctuary. It was one of the best preserved and most impressive temples in the Greek world until the Athenians started construction of the Parthenon in 447 BC, and they did it to sort of outdo this temple. Like most Greek temples, it has an orientation of east to west, with the entrance to the temple being over here on the eastern side. Now there's a couple of different reasons why the Greeks do this, because this is pretty usual across all Greek temples. And primarily that's so that we can let the morning light into the temple and keep it lit as well as possible. But there's also an association with the underworld with the western side. So it's like it's got the idea of it's got its back to the underworld. It's keeping that sort of part of the world out. It has a front porch called a pronaos. That's the entranceway that you go through here. You then go into the main body of the temple, which is called a naos, and that houses, in this case, the famous Chryselephantine statue of Zeus. And then it has this back porch, which really frustratingly isn't called a post-naos, but rather it's called an opsithodomos, which kind of translates to like back room. And it might reflect the idea that on some Greek temples, like the Parthenon for example, these were actually used as extra rooms that served different purposes. On the Parthenon, that function was housing the treasury that stored the Delian League. So looking at the columns for a moment, it's what we call a hexastyle temple, because it has 6 columns at the front and 6 columns at the back. And that's a pretty typical feature for Greek temples. It also has 13 columns on the left side and on the right side as well. So the fact that it has columns on all 4 sides of the temple means that it's called a peripateral temple. So moving on from the architecture of the temple, we'll now look at its decoration. And it's what we call a Doric temple, which means that these columns don't have at the top those Ionic style scrolls, or even those Corinthian style flowers, but instead it's this heavy, flat base at the top. What also makes this temple Doric is that this space above the columns is not a continuous band of sculpture. You'd get that on an Ionic temple, but instead is broken up with these square slabs that would be sculpted, these are called metopes, and these breakers called triglyphs. Now, the game likes to fill all the metopes on all the temples in the game as the labours of Heracles. But that is actually what's meant to be shown on this temple. You can see here we have too many metopes, which means too many labours, and they would repeat and go the whole way around. But in reality, there would be just 6 at the front, 6 of the labours on 6 metopes, and 6 at the back. So one of the most interesting metopes on the whole temple is this one here, which depicts the cleansing of the Augean stables. Now this scene depicts the subject matter of Heracles' 5th labour, where he had to clean King Augeas' stables. It was an impossible job, because these stables housed the greatest number of cattle in the whole of the Greek world. Accordingly, Heracles ingeniously diverts the course of the nearby Alpheus River, and also the river Peneus, and this would wash out the whole of the stables. Before he started to clean the stables, Heracles had actually asked King Augeas for 1/10 of the cattle, should he be able to do this in a day. and Augeas agrees because he never thought that Heracles could do it. When Heracles comes back successful, he refuses to pay up. So Heracles returns, comes back and kills Augeas, and in celebration of his victory, according to some myths at least, he then establishes the Olympic Games in honour of his father. So this metope is particularly interesting, as on the real Temple of Zeus, it's placed out of sequence, so it's not the 5th metope that you see. In reality, it was actually placed right over here on the right hand side. And the reason for that is because the local people of Elis are trying to promote the importance of this story. You see, it's a local legend, it took place nearby, so they're trying to emphasise their connection to this story. There are other surviving metopes that we see on this temple that survived to us really well, such as Heracles holding up the sky for Atlas, and also fighting against the Cretan bull. Above the metopes sits an area called the Pediment. This is a triangular shape that would usually be sculpted. On some temples, the figures would still be attached to the wall, and that's called sculpting in relief. And in others, like we're kind of being shown here, the figures are sculpted in the round. Now the game, again, likes to fill the pediments with generic scenes. But in reality, on this eastern side, we would have seen the moments before the chariot race between Pelops and Oenomaus. So this is another local story. This is where the king of Pisa, Oenomaus, challenges any would-be suitor of his daughter Hippodamia to a chariot race. If they lose, he kills them and he displays their bodies for all to see. Undeterred, the hero Pelops challenges him to a chariot race, and in some versions of the myth, he replaces the linchpin of the chariot's axle with one that was made of wax. As the race went on, the wax melted, the wheels fall off, and Oenomaus is thrown to his death. In some versions of the story, however, it's Oenomaus' charioteer that switches the linchpin. So this pediment shows the moments before that fateful chariot race, with a palpable sense of tension. No figure is touching, and indeed they're hardly moving. We see Oenomaus and his wife Sterope over on the left, and Oenomaus is arrogantly establishing the rules of the chariot race, and Pelops and Hippodamia are over on the right. Most of the background characters seem quite disinterested of the events of their masters. You see, for example, this playful boy just looking at his toes. That is all except this anxious seer, who's clearly aware of what's coming. Now over here on the western side, we actually have the complete opposite. We have a pediment that is completely full of action, and this is showing a scene called the Centromachy, which is quite a repeated theme in Greek art. This shows the wedding between King Pirithous, who was king of the Lapiths, and his wife Diademia. The Centaurs are invited to this wedding, but never having had wine before, they become really intoxicated and try and take off with the bride. And over on the left hand side of the pediment, that's exactly what we're meant to see. And Apollo is presiding in the middle. And so it's meant to be a really chaotic scene full of motion and drama. So one of the main functions of a Greek temple is to house the cult statue of the god, and that's exactly what this temple does. Inside the temple, we have the famous chryselephantine statue of Zeus, which we'll take a look at in a moment. Now, I'm not sure if the original temple would have had this hole in the roof, but evidence does suggest that the naos had to be modified in order to get this statue in. The statue itself sits at 12.4 meters tall. And Strabo tells us that if Zeus stood up, he sat down in the statue itself, but if he stood up, he would unroof the whole temple. So let's take a look at it. So here's the famous statue of Zeus. Now, as I say, it's called a chryselephantine statue, and that means that it is built of both gold and ivory. We have these ivory plates and gold panels that would be fixed to a wooden framework. The famous sculptor of this statue is the sculptor Phidias, who created the work in 435 BC, and that's quite some time after the initial construction of the temple. It depicts, as we see here, Zeus sat on his throne. He's holding a scepter in one hand and the goddess of victory, Nike, on the other. It was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and I wonder if it's trying to outdo the Athenians, who had a similar chryselephantine statue of Athena. And the Athenians are obviously making the Parthenon, I think, in part to try and outdo this temple. So I think, given that this statue was made in 435 BC, the people of Elis have gone, okay, the Parthenon's a better temple, arguably, than the Temple of Zeus, so let's make a better statue than you put in that temple. So there's some evidence of some ancient rivalry going on here. So that concludes my video today looking at the Temple of Zeus. I've tried to make sure I pick up on some of the key points needed for those of you studying OCR Classical Civilization. Thanks once again for checking out these videos. Please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys all in the next one.